Have you ever stopped to wonder if a 74-year-old man would have the strength to survive alone in a dark place, forgotten by time, where even his own breath seems to echo like a warning of danger? Imagine yourself trapped in ancient ruins, in an American city marked by stories of mystery and abandonment, like the hidden depths of New Orleans, known for its underground corridors and secrets that still intrigue explorers. Now, add to this an even more intense detail. I'm not alone. By my side, I have my faithful war dog, trained to protect, resist, and face challenges few humans would dare. Stay with me until the end, because what you discover now may surprise you. My name is Jack Miller, a war veteran born and raised in the heart of Texas, but now taking on challenges that go far beyond the battlefield. Some call me crazy, others resilient, but one thing is certain. At 74, I'm not willing to stop. Every challenge is a reminder that life only ends when you decide to give up. And this one, perhaps, was the craziest of all. Surviving 48 hours trapped in ancient ruins isn't just a test of physical endurance. It's a psychological struggle where your mind tries to convince you there's no way out, and every shadow transforms into an invisible enemy. These ruins hold centuries of untold stories, and walking through their dark corridors is like feeling the weight of time on your shoulders. The cold, cracked walls whisper legends of disappearances, secret cults, and phenomena that no one has been able to explain to this day. Have you ever experienced this? That feeling of being watched even when no one is around? That's exactly what I felt the moment the iron doors closed behind me, marking the beginning of the countdown to the next 48 hours. But I wasn't completely alone. Rex, my war dog, was more than a companion. He was my eyes, my ears, and often my courage. Trained to endure extreme situations, he seemed to sense every danger before I did. His muscles tense, his ears always alert, his stare fixed on nothing. Something in that darkness caught his attention, and it made me wonder. What really existed in there besides the two of us? Stay with me until the end, because the first few minutes inside the ruins already gave me signs that this challenge would be much more than just a test of survival. The darkness was unusual. It was dense, almost alive, and the sounds echoing between the ancient stones couldn't be just wind. There was a rhythm, like footsteps that didn't belong to any human. With each narrow corridor, each room covered in rubble and unfamiliar symbols, my heart raced. My soldier's instinct told me to remain calm, but my human instinct screamed that something was wrong. And to make matters worse, my war dog's reaction reinforced this feeling. Rex didn't bark for no reason. When he stopped, growled low, and stared into the darkness, I knew something was there. This wasn't just a physical challenge. It was a fight against the invisible, the inexplicable. Time seemed to drag, and every second inside those ancient ruins reminded me that the line between reality and hallucination is much thinner than we imagine. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Would you keep exploring? Or would you try to find a way out at any cost? What happened next is a story that needs to be told in detail. But first, you need to understand what it truly means to be surrounded by ruins that hide more than just stones and silence. That's when everything begins to transform into something bigger than I could have anticipated. With every step within those ruins, I felt as if I were crossing not only space, but also time. The distant sound of something dragging, the chill that seemed to rise from the ground, and Rex's rapid breathing created an atmosphere impossible to ignore. Perhaps you've felt it at some point in your life, that shiver that runs down your spine and makes you believe you're not alone, even when no one is around. It's strange, unsettling, but at the same time, it connects us with our own vulnerability. And that's precisely why I want to open this space for conversation with you. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what's touched you most so far. It could be a memory, a similar feeling, or simply your opinion on what you would do if you were in my shoes. Believe me, reading each comment is not only inspiring for me, but also for the entire community that grows around these stories. Your participation here is what keeps this channel going. It's the fuel that keeps alive the desire to share experiences that test the limits of courage and survival. So, if this narrative has captivated you so far, like the video so more people can find it. This simple gesture helps spread this message to those who also seek excitement, mystery, and overcoming. And if you feel like you'd like to walk with me through each new challenge, subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss anything yet to come. And trust me, there's still much to be told. As I write and recall every detail of that night in the ruins, I know I'm not alone. You're part of this. Every like, every subscription, every word left in the comments becomes a link in this journey. And together, we form something greater than just a story. We create a community that understands the value of resistance, of challenging ourselves, and of believing that even in the darkest moments, there is always a way out. And it was precisely in this spirit of resistance that the hours began to drag on, revealing that the real challenge was not just in the cold walls or the narrow corridors. I'm Jack Miller. Many know me only as a war veteran who survived impossible odds, but few understand what it means to live at 74, still seeking challenges that would bring much younger men to their knees. I was born in the heart of Texas, raised amidst dust, the sound of boots hitting the hard ground, and the certainty that life never gives anything away for free. From a young age, I learned to fend for myself, to hunt, to sleep in the cold, and to endure without complaint. When I grew up, the road led me straight to the army, and it was there that I found purpose, training, and also scars that never fade. For years, I served in places I'd rather not detail. I saw things that shouldn't be seen, felt fears that only those who have been on the brink of death can explain. But I also discovered a strength that arises when there's no other way out than to fight. This strength never abandoned me. When I returned home, many told me I should rest, enjoy my old age. But I could never reconcile myself to the idea of standing still. For me, life is movement, and movement, in my case, has always come with challenges. That's how I met Rex. He's not just any dog. Rex was trained from a puppy for war missions. Intelligent, strong, disciplined, with sharp instincts that surpass even those of seasoned soldiers. When I first looked into his eyes, I recognized the same flame I carry within me, the refusal to give up. Since then, we've become inseparable partners. He doesn't speak, but he communicates so clearly that I often wonder if he understands more than any human. In risky situations, Rex has always been my radar. Where I didn't notice anything, he was already alert. Where I hesitated, he advanced. It was with him that I decided to take on this new challenge, to survive 48 hours within the ancient ruins of New Orleans, a city marked by mystery, dark histories, and secrets that echo in its buildings. I chose this place because it's not just a hostile physical environment, but a psychological battlefield. The enemy there isn't just cold, hunger, or loneliness. The enemy is the mind, which insists on creating shadows, amplifying every noise, making us believe there's something beyond what meets the eye. This isn't the first time I've entered places others would avoid. I've slept in deserts where the sand cut like a blade. I've traversed forests where every step could hide a trap. But there was something different about these ruins. Maybe it was the story of unexplained disappearances. Maybe the symbols engraved on the stones that no one has ever been able to decipher. Maybe just the feeling of entering a place where time refuses to pass. Many would call it superstition, but I've learned never to ignore signs. Still, I accepted. Part of me needed this test. Part of me wanted to know if, even at 74, I still had the strength to endure where others would fail. Throughout life, I've realized that the greatest challenges aren't those we face with weapons in hand, but those that test our hearts. Being alone in a dark place, without guarantees, with our mind trying to deceive us every minute, is a silent war. It's a war against ourselves. And I decided to wage this war, accompanied only by Rex, because I knew he would never abandon me. Before entering the ruins, I prepared as I always do. I don't carry excess, just the essentials. A little water, some basic food, a knife, a flashlight. No luxuries. The purpose of a challenge like this is to feel every difficulty, to rely more on instinct than comfort. The less you carry, the more you learn. This is a truth only those who have lived in hostile camps understand. Rex, for his part, needs nothing but his own strength. His senses are his tools. His loyalty is his weapon. The moment we crossed the entrance to the ruins, I felt the air change. It wasn't just colder, it was heavier, almost suffocating. The silence wasn't complete silence. There was an echo, as if each step called to something dormant. The damp walls, covered in moss and strange symbols, seemed to watch us. And it was at this point that the most important part of this challenge began. Understanding the context, not just physical, but emotional. I knew that from then on, I wouldn't just fight hunger and fatigue. I would fight memories, buried fears, the voice in my mind that insisted it wasn't worth it. And that's why I'm sharing this experience with you, because each of us, at some point in our lives, faces our own ruins. It may not be a dark corridor of ancient stones, but it may be a loss, a loneliness, a fear that seems greater than ourselves. What separates those who survive from those who lose their way is the ability to keep going even when there's no clarity, even when the path seems impossible. It's the ability to believe there's a way out, even if it's not yet visible. If you've ever felt something similar, if you've ever faced a situation that seemed hopeless, you know what I'm talking about. It's at this point that strength comes not from muscles, but from the spirit. It's at this point that a faithful companion, be it a friend, a relative, or even a dog like Rex, can be the difference between giving up and moving on. This is the context that gives meaning to the challenge. It's not just about 48 hours in ruins. It's about proving, to myself and those who accompany me, that age doesn't define limits, that fear doesn't define destiny, and that courage is a choice made every second. At 74, many would say my time for fighting battles is over, but I believe quite the opposite. Time only shows us who we truly are. Every wrinkle, every scar, every memory of struggle is a reminder that we are still here. And as long as we are here, we can endure. That is the essence of being alive. That is what drives me. That is what keeps me seeking places like these ruins, not because I need to prove something to others, but because I need to prove myself. You might wonder why anyone would put themselves in such a situation. The answer is simple. Because living without challenges is dying in silence. I'd rather risk the unknown than settle into a routine that doesn't challenge me. I'd rather face ancient ruins with my war dog than sit in a chair waiting for time to pass. Because at the end of the day, life is made of stories. And stories only exist when there's the courage to live them. This is my context. This is me, Jack Miller, veteran survivor, ordinary man who refuses to accept that age is a barrier. And Rex, my inseparable partner, my silent guardian, my brother in arms. Together, we entered these ruins knowing that we would emerge different, whatever the outcome. This is the starting point for everything you're yet to experience. This is the beginning of the journey that led me to 48 hours of silence, shadows, and discovery. When I passed through the rusted gate of the ancient ruins, I immediately felt I was entering a world apart, as if I had crossed an invisible border separating the present from the past. The air grew denser, heavier, almost difficult to breathe. It was as if every molecule was impregnated with forgotten memories, stories buried by time, and secrets that should never be revealed. The humidity was suffocating. The stone walls, covered in dark green moss and black stains, dripped water in rhythmic intervals, creating a repetitive sound that resembled a macabre metronome. Each falling drop echoed in the corridors, giving the sensation that someone or something was always walking behind me. Rex, my war dog, stopped just inside the entrance. His fur stood on end, and his muscles tensed. He sniffed the air, emitting a low growl that reverberated like a warning. I knew that behavior. It wasn't fear, but alertness. Rex was sensing something I hadn't yet. I moved forward, taking cautious steps, and with every meter I walked, I noticed that the darkness seemed to come alive. The beam of my flashlight illuminated only a few steps ahead, and beyond that, there were only shadows that moved in step with my gaze, as if mocking my presence. The ruins of New Orleans had a dark reputation. Ancient buildings, built on foundations that, according to locals, hid forgotten cemeteries and corridors used in clandestine rituals. Many believed that they still echoed with the voices of secret cults, forbidden practices, and even human sacrifices. I didn't know if all of this was true, but I knew that each stone there carried an unusual energy. The symbols engraved on the walls were proof of this. Markings I'd never seen before. Interlocking circles, lines intersecting at odd angles, and figures that resembled both animals and demons. Time had eroded some of them, but enough remained to cause unrest. With each corridor, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. There were no windows, no visible exit, only narrow paths branching off in every direction, as if the place itself wanted to confuse me. The low ceiling was supported by rotting wooden beams, some on the verge of collapse. The smell of mildew and wet earth mingled with the odor of rusted iron, and the faint aroma of something reminiscent of sulfur. It was an environment that belonged not only to the physical world, but also to the psychological. I knew that these conditions, combined with the darkness and isolation, could drive any man to the brink of sanity. As I walked, the silence was constantly interrupted by unexplained noises, a scratching sound coming from the walls, as if nails or claws were moving within the stone, cracking sounds coming from the ceiling, as if something heavy was dragging itself across it, and at times I could have sworn I heard whispers. It wasn't the wind, because there wasn't enough airflow to generate such sounds. They were quick, murmured words in a language I couldn't understand. Rex reacted to these sounds with alert ears, focusing his gaze on nothing. There were moments when he barked abruptly, angrily, staring into dark corridors where I could see nothing. This only increased the tension. I learned to trust his instincts more than my own eyes. The ground was uneven, covered in loose stones, rubble, and broken wood. Every step was a challenge, as any carelessness could cause me to trip or produce a loud sound that would echo off the walls like a call. And this was another detail that struck me. The acoustics of the ruins were bizarre. A simple movement seemed to multiply into dozens of echoes, creating the illusion that several people were walking alongside me. I often stopped to check that no one was behind me, but all I found was Rex's shadow and emptiness. This feeling of not being alone had stayed with me from the beginning. As I progressed, I noticed that larger rooms opened up in the middle of the corridors. They were circular spaces, with higher ceilings and walls covered in even more complex symbols. In one of these rooms, I found the remains of melted candles, as if someone had performed rituals not long ago. The marks on the floor formed an irregular circle, and in the center were dark stains that could have been rust, or something worse. Rex sniffed the spot and began to growl, pulling at my arm as if to pull me away. I decided to follow his instincts and continue to the next corridor. This wasn't the time to question the origin of those marks. This was the time to survive. The walls also seemed alive. Sometimes when I ran my hand over them, I felt vibrations, as if something were pulsing behind the stone. In certain areas, the moss formed patterns that resembled contorted faces, wide eyes, mouths open in eternal silence. I knew it might just be my imagination influenced by fear, but I couldn't ignore it. The more I observed, the more I believed the entire place was an entity, something breathing and watching me. These weren't just abandoned ruins. They were living ruins. The temperature also fluctuated inexplicably. In some corridors, the heat was stifling, as if I were inside an oven. In others, the cold was so intense that my breath came out in clouds of steam. These sudden changes were illogical. No natural environment behaves this way. It was yet another sign that I was not in an ordinary space. It was an environment designed perhaps by human hands, perhaps by something greater, but certainly constructed to confuse, frighten, and punish. Minutes turned into hours, and all sense of time began to vanish. There was no natural light, no external sounds, just that endless maze of corridors, rooms, and symbols. I began to wonder if I had entered a space that didn't follow the same rules as the outside world. And this thought, absurd as it was, seemed increasingly plausible. Rex remained firm at my side, but he grew increasingly restless. His quick glances into the shadows told me something was there with us, something that preferred to hide and observe in silence. There was a moment when I approached one of the walls covered in symbols. As I touched the center of a circle, I felt the icy stone vibrate slightly. It was so quick I thought I'd imagined it. But Rex reacted instantly, barking and lunging at the wall, as if something were trying to break through. I grabbed him, pulling him back, my heart racing. It was in that instant that I understood the true nature of the challenge. It wasn't just about surviving the physical conditions, but also resisting the temptation to believe everything those runners were trying to show me. Because if I believed too much, I might lose my mind. The ruins were a test, not only of strength, but of sanity. It was as if every detail had been designed to break the minds of anyone who dared enter. The heavy silence, the indecipherable symbols, the originless sounds, the faces formed by the moss, the inexplicable smells, all of this formed a trap. a psychological trap that, combined with the isolation, could turn any man into a prisoner of his own mind. And it was at this point that I realized the importance of having Rex with me. He was my point of balance. When I began to doubt reality, all I had to do was look at him. His instincts didn't lie. If Rex was alert, I should be too. If he was calm, there was room to breathe. That's what kept me going in those first moments inside that place. The ruins of New Orleans weren't just ancient stones. They were an invisible battlefield where unknown forces tested my every heartbeat. And in that moment, still at the beginning of the 48 hours, I already knew this would be the greatest challenge of my life. When I accepted this challenge, I knew it wouldn't be like any other. Surviving 48 hours inside the ancient ruins of New Orleans didn't just mean enduring the darkness, the narrow corridors, and the feeling of being surrounded by something invisible. It meant, above all, obeying clear and non-negotiable rules, rules that would shape the experience and test my physical and mental limits. These rules weren't written down. They weren't imposed by others. They were part of the very essence of the challenge. And for me, respecting them was what made the ordeal real. The first rule was simple. Enter with only the essentials. No overstuffed backpacks, no modern conveniences, nothing that could transform suffering into comfort. I had with me only the bare minimum to sustain life. A flashlight with limited batteries, a sharp knife, a canteen with rationed water, and a few rations of dry food. There was no mattress, no blanket, no complete first aid kit. I wanted to feel every hardship, face every discomfort. Because deep down, this is the essence of survival, relying more on your mind and instinct than on resources. The body must suffer for the mind to be tested. The second rule was clear. No exit before 48 hours. Once the rusty door closed behind me, there would be no return until the time was up. This was part of the pact I'd made with myself. The place was sealed off, and I'd left a stipulation outside that the entrance would only be reopened after the deadline. It was like an invisible clock that started ticking from the first second. If I gave in to fear, if I knocked on the door asking to leave, it would mean giving up. And giving up wasn't part of my life. The third rule involved food. The food I brought was minimal, enough only for short breaks. This wasn't carelessness. It was intentional. Hunger is part of the process. It alters perception, affects the senses, makes each second more intense. I knew that at some point, a lack of physical energy would overtake me. But I also knew that the true fuel for this challenge wouldn't be food, but determination. Rex, my war dog, wouldn't need much. He'd already undergone extreme training with me, and was accustomed to situations where there was little or nothing to eat. His strong body and trained instincts were as prepared as mine. The fourth rule was to resist without contact with the outside world. No radio, no cell phone, no call for help. Loneliness is the greatest enemy of human beings in scenarios like these. It corrodes the mind, creates ghosts, fuels paranoia. Many soldiers I met in the war were not defeated by bullets, but by loneliness and the fear it brings. I needed to feel this again. I needed to face this emptiness head on. Because in absolute silence, surrounded by walls that seem to watch, the mind shows its true face. The fifth rule was perhaps the most frightening. Don't close your eyes to what the ruins revealed. This was the crux of the challenge. I knew it wouldn't just be physical. The stories about the place spoke of ancient rituals, hidden symbols, and voices that still echoed in the corridors. The rule was clear. If I saw, heard, or felt something, I couldn't deny it. I couldn't pretend it didn't exist. I had to face it. Ignoring it would mean failure. Facing it would mean evolving. This rule, more than all the others, demanded the most courage from me. These were the 5 pillars that underpinned the challenge. Enter only with the essentials. Don't leave before 48 hours. Ration food, remain in complete isolation. And don't shy away from what's revealed. It sounds simple when said out loud, but in practice, each of these rules weighs heavily. Together, they formed the invisible prison I had agreed to inhabit. The moment the door behind me closed, I heard the clang of the iron locking echoing off the walls. It was like hearing a sentence. Rex and I were officially trapped there. The invisible clock had begun ticking, and each passing second reminded me that I wouldn't be free again for 2 full days. 2 days where sunlight wouldn't reach me, where cold and silence would be my constant companions. Hunger set in early, even though there was still food. This happens because the body understands what's coming and tries to react. The stomach contracts, the brain sends warning signals, as if to say, conserve energy, because what lies ahead will demand more than you can give. I drank only a sip from the canteen and saved the rest. With every drop I swallowed, I remembered there would be no replacement. That was the rule. The flashlight was turned on within the first few minutes, but I knew I couldn't rely on it. The darkness was dense, almost solid. The light's range was short, and the shadows seemed to mock me, dancing constantly out of focus. I learned then to walk slowly, feeling the ground with my boots, with Rex always a few steps ahead. He was my silent guide, sniffing every corridor, alert to every movement. I knew that as long as he was with me, I had a chance. But I also knew that any mistake would be punished. Isolation was the hardest blow right from the start. The mind, accustomed to sounds, images, and interactions, reacts badly when everything is taken away at once. Silence isn't just the absence of noise. It's a weight that settles inside the head, amplifying every heartbeat, every breath, every slight movement. After a few hours, you start to hear things that aren't there. The sound of footsteps that don't exist, distant voices, whispers without an owner. It's at this point that sanity begins to be tested, and that was precisely the intention of the rule. As I walked through the corridors, the 5th rule began to show its force. It was impossible to ignore what my eyes saw and my ears picked up. On one of the walls, a circular symbol seemed to glow in the flashlight's light, as if freshly carved. It was impossible for something so clear to have withstood the test of time. But it was there. Rex stopped in front of it, growled, and held his position. I could have turned my back. I could have continued on, pretending not to see it. But the rule was clear. I had to face it. I stood before that symbol for long minutes, until I felt my mind about to give in. Only then did I decide to continue. These rules weren't just limits. They were guides. They shaped the experience and set the pace of the challenge. Each time my body cried out for comfort, I remembered the first rule. Each time my mind begged me to give up, I remembered the second. Each time hunger gripped me, I remembered the third. When the silence became unbearable, I remembered the fourth. And when the shadows tried to deceive me, I clung to the 5th. The truth is that no survival challenge is sustained by the physical alone. The body may be strong, but without mental discipline, it collapses. These rules were the foundation that kept me standing. They reminded me that I wasn't there by chance. I was there because I had chosen, and choosing means shouldering the weight of the decision until the end. Beside Rex, I continued forward, alert, vigilant, knowing that every minute within those ruins brought me closer to something greater. I didn't know what I would find, I didn't know what lurked behind the shadows, nor what those corridors would reveal, but I knew that without obeying the rules, I had no chance of completing the 48 hours. Time continued to tick, and the pressure mounted. But within me, a certainty also grew. I hadn't entered just to survive. I had entered to prove that rules, no matter how harsh, can keep us alive. And in that heavy silence, surrounded by darkness, that was exactly what kept me going. The first few hours inside those ruins were a direct plunge into a world that seemed to no longer obey the same rules as reality. When the iron door closed behind Rex and me, the sound echoed like thunder trapped in a tight space. It was at that moment that I realized that adaptation would be the key to resisting what was to come. Every second from then on would count. And the first few seconds are always the most dangerous, because that's when the mind, still fresh from the outside world, desperately tries to cling to the normalcy that no longer exists. The first thing I did was choose a safe starting point. There was no way I could blindly advance through the endless corridors without first establishing a base, a space where I could rest, observe, and begin to adapt. I found a rectangular room not far from the entrance, with a low ceiling and moss-covered walls. The place wasn't comfortable, but it had the advantage of being relatively free of debris and having only one entrance, which allowed me to better control my movements. This would be my first refuge. I set my backpack on the ground, leaned the flashlight against one of the rocks, and took a deep breath. Rex remained alert, sniffing every corner, growling softly at times, but soon lay down near the entrance, like a guardian. I knew I wouldn't have time to set up anything elaborate. There were no mattresses, no blankets, just cold stone and silence. I took off my coat and folded it into a makeshift pillow. I spread out a piece of canvas I'd brought just to avoid direct contact with the damp ground. It was small, but enough to symbolize my adaptation to this space. The next step was to observe the environment and learn to listen to what it had to say. A common mistake people make when entering such places is to try to ignore sounds, smells, and sensations. But in hostile environments, every detail can be the difference between staying alive and being lost. I spent long minutes just listening. The drops fell at constant intervals, forming an almost hypnotic rhythm. There were also occasional cracks coming from the ceiling, as if the wood were adjusting to the weight of time. But what caught my attention most were the distant sounds. Footsteps? I couldn't tell. It could have just been the echo of my own movements, but they sounded different, as if they were lighter, more shuffling, and they always seemed to come from different directions. Rex reacted curiously. At times he would raise his head and stare at a dark spot. I followed his gaze, shining my flashlight, but found nothing. He would then lower his head again, but he never stopped being alert. This reaction of his, silent and firm, was what kept me balanced. Because if I had been alone, I might have already believed I was going crazy within the first few hours. Hunger began to set in quickly, but I'd expected it. I pulled a small piece of jerky from my backpack and shared it between Rex and me. It was small, almost symbolic, but enough to calm our stomachs and give us the feeling we were prepared to face the early morning. I rationed each piece as if it were gold. I swallowed slowly, savoring every fiber of the meat, as if it were the last meal I'd ever have. This practice wasn't just physical, it was mental. When you eat little and slowly, you teach your brain that you still have control, and control is what keeps you sane. With my stomach partially satisfied, I began to explore my immediate surroundings. I walked with my flashlight low, illuminating only the floor in front of me. I didn't want to waste energy or create the illusion that light would solve everything. The hallway leading from the room forked in two. To the left, the path seemed narrower and stuffier. To the right, there was a larger space, but the air was colder, as if there were an invisible current. I decided not to stray too far right away. I returned to the room, marking the walls with small scratches from my knife to ensure I could find my way back if the darkness confused me. This was practical adaptation, creating landmarks, creating a sense of orientation where nothing else made sense. My body began to feel the weight of the environment. The hard floor punished my back. The cold crept up my legs, and the silence assaulted my ears. But my mind needed to adjust. Every time I closed my eyes, strange images appeared. Faces, shadows, memories of the war mixed with the symbols I'd seen on the walls. I knew they were just hallucinations created by a combination of exhaustion and fear. So I opened my eyes, took a deep breath, and focused on Rex. The sound of his breathing was my balance. As long as he breathed beside me, I knew I was in the present. The darkness also had to be faced. I couldn't rely on the flashlight all the time, so I turned it off for a few minutes to let my eyes adjust. The pitch black was absolute. It felt like being dipped in paint. I reached out and couldn't see my own fingers. My heart raced, my body broke out in a cold sweat, but I forced myself to remain still. I had to learn to be in the dark, to hear more than see, to feel more than see. When I turned the flashlight back on, the light seemed brighter, like a reward for having withstood that test. This was one of the first lessons of adaptation. The darkness only wins if you run from it. The following hours were a constant exercise in discipline, eating little, drinking even less, resting for short intervals, and always being aware of my surroundings. With each new sound, I had to decide whether to investigate or ignore it, and this was part of the psychological adaptation. The environment wanted me to give in to panic, to run in circles until I lost my way. But I knew I needed to conserve energy. I chose to observe rather than act. Every shadow was a potential enemy, but also a test to measure my calm. Rex, on the other hand, seemed to carry an inexhaustible energy. Even without ample food, he remained steadfast, scanning his surroundings with alert gazes. Sometimes he would get up, walk into the hallway, and stand still, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. He would return after a few minutes, lie down again, but his eyes never closed completely. He knew this was our first line of defense. As the night wore on, the cold began to intensify. The non-existent wind outside seemed to seep through the cracks in the walls, creating icy drafts that bit at my skin. I huddled up, pulled my coat over me, and held firm. My body shivered, but I knew I had to resist. Shivering is just a warning that the body is fighting heat loss, and resisting discomfort was part of the adaptation. But what truly marked those first hours wasn't the hunger, the cold, or the darkness. It was the invisible presence that seemed to constantly approach and recede. At times, it was as if something were breathing inside the room, besides Rex and me. The air grew heavier, the sounds grew closer. I would close my eyes, listen, and swear I could hear slow footsteps circling around. But when I shone my flashlight into the void, there was nothing. This sensation never disappeared during those first hours. And perhaps this was the greatest challenge of adaptation, learning to live with the invisible, with that which cannot be explained, without allowing it to consume the mind. I knew the first few hours were crucial. Many who face similar trials fail early on, because the shock between the outside world and confinement is brutal. But I stuck to the rules I'd established. Eat sparingly, conserve energy, Observe more than act. Trust Rex, and don't shy away from whatever came my way. Gradually, I noticed my body and mind beginning to accept the new rhythm. The silence stopped being merely frightening and started to feel predictable. The cracking sounds from the ceiling no longer made me jump. Distant whispers, though unsettling, became part of the environment. It was as if I were melting into the place. This was the initial adaptation. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't smooth, but it was necessary. Because without this process, I wouldn't have had a chance of surviving the remaining 48 hours. It was just at the beginning, and I knew the ruins still held much more than they were revealing. But I also knew I had already taken the most important first step, accepting discomfort as part of the journey. And so it was that the first few hours became a silent pact between Rex and me, and that hostile environment. A pact of resistance, where every heartbeat was a reminder that there was still much to face. Heart. Time within the ruins had become an invisible prison, where each second seemed to last minutes, and each minute became a crushing weight. I had already adapted to the cold, the silence, and even the hunger. But there was something that could not be explained, the presence that haunted every step. And it was in this atmosphere, at this point where my mind was already consumed by doubt, that everything happened. The moment when Rex, my war dog, revealed something that would completely change my perception of the challenge. Rex had always been more than a companion. He was my line of defense, my radar, my silent alert against any threat. During the war, I often trusted his instincts more than any map or guidance from superiors. And within those ruins, it was no different. He had already shown strange signs, growling at empty corridors, staring into corners where nothing seemed to exist. But that night, something in him changed. Something I had never seen before. We were in a large room, one of the largest we'd encountered so far. The ceiling was higher, and the walls were covered in even more complex and disturbing symbols. Some of them appeared to have been scratched recently, as if someone, not so long ago, had returned to reinforce old markings. The floor was covered in loose stones and scraps of wood, as if the place had partially collapsed. The silence was suffocating. I was sitting against a wall, trying to rest, when I noticed Rex slowly getting up. At first, I thought he'd heard something ordinary, like the noise of a small animal. But I soon realized otherwise. His body was rigid, his tail low, his ears fully alert. He growled low, subdued, as if trying to warn without attracting attention. He lifted his head, sniffed the air, and took 2 steps forward. The sound of claws clicking against stone echoed through the space, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I pointed the flashlight in the direction he was looking. Nothing, just the dark corridor that stretched beyond the room. But Rex didn't back away. Instead, he began to advance slowly, as if something were calling him. I hesitated. I didn't want to follow him, but I also knew that ignoring his reaction would be a mistake. I stood up, gripping the knife firmly in my left hand and the flashlight in my right. My heart was already beating faster, and every muscle in my body was on alert. It was then that Rex barked. It wasn't just any bark, but an explosive, loud sound that echoed off the walls like a command. He charged down the hallway at speed, disappearing into the darkness before I could catch him. I ran after him, calling out to him, but there was no answer. Only the sound of his paws fading into the distance. The flashlight trembled in my hand with each hurried step, and the echo of my movements made it seem like dozens of people were running with me. The hallway was narrow, and the air grew colder with every foot I walked. I began to hear strange noises, as if something was scratching at the walls from within. Fear began to grow, but the instinct to protect Rex was stronger. After a few minutes of running, I found him standing motionless, staring at a wall at the end of the hallway. His breathing was laboured, and his body was leaning forward as if about to attack. I shone the flashlight where he was looking, and saw something I'll never forget. On the wall was a massive symbol, etched deep into the stone, its lines so sharp they seemed untouched by time. It was unlike any other I'd seen before. This one seemed to pulse, as if it had a life of its own. The flashlight's light seemed to distort around it, creating shadows that didn't obey logic. Rex was completely mesmerized. He didn't move, didn't blink, just growled lowly, his teeth bared, as if facing an invisible enemy. I approached slowly, trying to understand what was happening. Then something unexpected happened. Rex leapt against the wall. There was nothing there but cold stone, but he lunged forward as if he'd seen a real creature. The impact made a dull thud, and he recoiled, barking desperately, looking around as if something had escaped him. The scene was disturbing. I'd never seen that dog react like that. He, who had always been disciplined, trained to attack only on command, was acting as if he were fighting a real presence, something I couldn't see. I tried to restrain him, holding his leash, but he remained agitated, pulling hard, as if trying to chase something escaping through the corridors. His breathing was heavy, and his gaze seemed filled with an unusual fury. It was at that moment that I felt something even stranger. The air around us grew heavy, as if it had turned to water. The sound of the environment changed. It was no longer just the ordinary echoes of the ruins. There was something more, a kind of collective murmur, like voices whispering together, each in a different language, all overlapping. Rex stopped pulling and stood still again, staring into the darkness behind me. I quickly turned the flashlight, but again there was nothing, just the empty hallway. Still, I had the distinct sensation that something had passed. I can't describe it exactly, but it was as if a shadow had crossed the space, too quick to see, yet dense enough to feel. My entire body broke out in goosebumps, and cold sweat ran down my back. What was unexpected wasn't just Rex's reaction, but the way he seemed to connect with it. It wasn't fear I saw in him. It was determination. It was as if he'd taken on the role of guardian, willing to face whatever was there, even if I couldn't see it. That was the turning point. The moment I realized the ruins held something beyond the physical, beyond what could be touched or explained. From that moment on, everything changed. I could no longer see the challenge as just 48 hours of resistance. It was no longer just about enduring hunger, cold, or silence. The true enemy was hidden, invisible, operating through shadows, symbols, and the very atmosphere. And Rex, with his instinct, had shown me that it wasn't imagination. It was real. He had responded to something concrete, even if I didn't have eyes to see it. I spent long minutes in that corridor, trying to calm Rex and myself. I spoke to him as I had in wartime, in a low, firm tone, reminding him that we were together. Gradually, he relaxed, but he never took his eyes off the darkness. I knew the fight wasn't over yet. I knew that whatever was there had merely retreated. It was lurking, waiting for the next move. We decided to return to the starting room, but the walk back was different. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow more menacing, and Rex, even walking beside me, never stopped looking back. It was on that return that I knew for sure. The critical point had been reached. There was no turning back. I was inside something bigger, something watching me, something that wasn't about to let me leave easily. The first few hours had been mere preparation. The real challenge began there, when I realized I was no longer just an intruder in ancient ruins, but someone who had awakened something dormant. And Rex, my faithful companion, had been the first to sense it. The cub's unexpectedness was the signal, the warning, and I knew that from that moment on, every step would be a battle not only against the environment, but against the invisible that inhabited those walls. The last few hours within those ruins were the longest of my life. I can't say whether it was exhaustion, the hunger that was already sapping my strength, or the fear that had become a constant presence, but it felt as if time had stopped. Each minute felt like a heavy burden, as if the world had conspired to keep me trapped in that stone labyrinth. My mind no longer functioned clearly, and each step was taken more by obstinacy than by any remaining energy. Rex, my faithful companion, remained by my side, but even in him I could see signs of wear and tear. The war dog that once moved with strength and determination now walked more slowly, his paws steady, but his eyes weary. Still, even exhausted, he wouldn't give up. It was as if he carried within himself a greater responsibility, a silent oath that he would stay with me until the end, no matter the cost. This bond was the only flame that kept me going. Hunger was no longer just a nuisance. It was pain. With every movement, my muscles groaned, my bones seemed to creak, and my body showed signs of reaching its limit. I had rationed every bite of food, every sip of water, but I knew it hadn't been enough. My stomach tightened, my heart raced in moments of weakness, and sometimes my vision darkened. It was like walking across a battlefield with no ammunition, only the hope of survival. The cold had also intensified. The walls of the ruins, previously merely damp, now seemed to emit a frigid air that penetrated my skin and chilled my bones. I huddled inside my coat, but there was no escaping the feeling. My body shivered involuntarily, a natural survival reflex, but each tremor seemed to expend even more energy. Rex, despite his thick fur, felt it too. He approached me, lay down beside me, and together we shared what little warmth remained. It was a silent alliance against the relentless cold. The silence, which had previously bothered me, was now unbearable. It wasn't empty. It was full of whispers, of noises coming from places impossible to identify, of footsteps that never approached, but also never receded. It was a living silence, making me doubt whether I was still lucid. There were moments when I closed my eyes and saw images that made no sense. Faces I'd never known, voices I didn't recognize, symbols that repeated themselves in my mind as if etched in iron. I knew this was the weight of exhaustion, but I also knew that the ruins had their own way of attacking the mind. The last few hours weren't a fight against walls and hallways. They were a fight against myself, against the temptation to give in, to lie down on the cold floor and simply let time pass. My mind whispered that I didn't need to continue, that I'd already tasted enough. But I knew that if I gave in, if I closed my eyes for too long, I might not have the strength to get up again. Resistance was the only choice. It was at this point that Rex demonstrated once again why I could never have done it alone. When my legs faltered, he would gently nudge me with his body, as if telling me to keep going. When I sat for too long, he would bark softly, getting my attention, forcing me to get up. In one of the last hours, when I thought I couldn't do it anymore, Rex ran into a side hallway and barked insistently. At first, I thought he sensed some threat, but when I followed him, I realized he had found a more open space. where the air was less dense, almost breathable. It was there that I rested for a few precious minutes, recovering some of my remaining energy. This attitude of Rex's was what gave me the clarity to understand that the challenge was no longer just physical. It was spiritual. The ruins didn't just want my body. They wanted my mind. They wanted me to surrender to fear, to despair, to the voices that kept multiplying in my head. And I realized that if it weren't for Rex, I would have already lost this battle. The dog didn't just protect me. He reminded me of who I was. A soldier, a survivor, someone who doesn't bow down to the impossible. The strange sounds had increased in the last few hours. It was as if the ruins knew the end was near and wanted to test me one last time. Scratches on the walls, creaks in the ceiling, invisible chains that seemed to drag along the floor. And above all, the murmurs. They were louder, closer, as if hundreds of voices were gathered around me, watching, waiting for the moment I would fall. At one point, I even believed I saw figures moving in the darkness, tall, misshapen shadows, their eyes glowing for fractions of a second. But when I blinked, everything disappeared. My mind no longer distinguished between reality and illusion. I knew this, and that was the scariest part, because when reality slips away, anything becomes possible. It's at this point that many give up. But I couldn't give up. Rex wouldn't let me. He stared at me as if he understood I needed to keep going. And I kept going, even though I was out of strength, even though my body was begging me to stop. The last few hours were marked by a strange feeling of repetition. I walked the corridors and felt as if I'd already been to the same places. The symbols on the walls seemed to multiply, as if space itself were reinventing itself to confuse me. I scratched marks with the knife, but after a few minutes they disappeared, or perhaps I was no longer sure where I'd made them. It was like being trapped in an endless loop, where time and space didn't follow the same rules. The exhaustion was becoming unbearable. My legs felt like lead. The flashlight no longer shone as brightly, and the shadows multiplied around me. At times, I considered simply turning off the light and embracing the darkness. But each time that thought arose, Rex would come closer, nuzzle my arm, and remind me that I wasn't finished yet. He was the thread that kept me grounded in reality. It was in this state, somewhere between sanity and madness, that I noticed something curious. The voices, the murmurs, the footsteps, they all faded as I focused on Rex. It was as if his presence was a shield, a barrier against whatever inhabited those ruins, and that gave me new strength, because I understood that we weren't alone by chance. He was there for a reason. He was an essential part of the challenge. The final hours, then, became a slow, almost ritualistic march. Each step was an act of resistance, each breath a reminder that there was still life in me. There was no guaranteed victory, no certainty of an exit, only the silent promise to continue until the end. And so it was, amid shadows, cold, and invisible voices, that we reached the limit. When I finally realized time was up, there was no celebration. There were no screams, no immediate relief. There was only silence, a heavy silence that seemed to observe, almost regret, that I had resisted. The ruins hadn't defeated me, but I also knew I hadn't completely, because part of me was still trapped inside. Part of me would remain forever in that stone labyrinth, along with the symbols, murmurs, and shadows.